Hi, my name is Andrew Lee, also known as user of Huzhedo on the wikis. And this is talk about Wiki API Connector for WikidataCon 2021. I'm currently the Wikimedian at large at the Smithsonian Institution in the United States. And if anyone has the Etherpad for the session, feel free to put in the chat. I don't think I have it up. And feel free to put in questions in the chat as we go along. I'm happy to answer any questions as time permits. As many of you know, the Smithsonian Institution in the United States is the world's largest museum education research complex in the world. It alone has 19 museums, galleries, and a zoo. And in 2020, it started their open access initiative, which allowed us in the Wiki community to upload commons images, metadata on a scale we've never seen before, which is great. But one of the problems is, how do you get this efficiently into commons and all the structured data that's there? So that's the talk I have today about what are some strategies for doing this and what kind of implementation have we come up with. So the basic formula for any kind of movement of data is typically what we call the ETL, or extract, transform, load. And more importantly, how do we allow for non-developers to be active in this space? So the reason why I put all the details here is because this is very intimidating for a non-developer to extract the content from an open API in JSON or JavaScript object notation, to actually have a script or something to take that content from a GLAMS API and to use Python or JavaScript or OpenRefine or Google Sheets to somehow transform that into what Commons wants to see, what Wikidata wants to see, what ontologies we have, and then finally to load that into Commons or Wikidata. That's actually a lot of steps along the way. We have tools that do that, but it's not really an integrated workflow right now, right? So for example, this is just a basic way of thinking about it. If we have an identifier, and this is an example of identifier for the Smithsonian American Art Museum, how can we take that, hit the API at the Smithsonian, get the metadata that we see here that you can kind of read as being, the title, the artist, the JPEG for where you can get that image. And how might we generate the proper Commons template so that when we upload this to Commons, it becomes really nice like this, which is what we want to see with licensing information, with information from the fields of that object record, of a high quality image, and a file name that's meaningful for the community, right? These are all little, not so hard things, but it'd be nice to automate this in some way, or to allow ordinary folks who don't have developer capabilities to be part of this. So the existing solutions that we kind of have, but not really, are things like GlamWiki Toolset, the original bulk upload tool, which is no longer maintained or recommended right now. There actually was a GLAM2 Commons tool that was developed during the Summer of Code, but it only supports 2 organizations, and that doesn't really, it's not been maintained at all. GlamPipe, which was presented at this conference, is great to see. There's more activity now and revival on that tool, which is great to see. And I'll explain why it's not a rivalry here. It actually could be a very virtuous collaboration there. And then PattyPan, which is our workhorse for uploading images, recently has had some authentication issues. Thankfully, Alban Larson and other folks are helping to solve this. But PattyPan is not really structured data on Commons or helping in that area, right? It also doesn't help necessarily map the metadata. You have to do that on your own. So we do have some existing solutions. When I was working with the Met Museum, and I'm still doing work with them, we created a monolithic tool for doing this. So it is a Python app that actually runs on Tool Labs, but it is basically one gigantic Python script that has all the details baked into Python. So can we do better than that? I think we can. Spreadsheets are really nice for doing some of these things as a one-off task, but they're really not great for long-term maintainability, right? They don't capture a process necessarily. They will help you clean one data set one time, but to put it through 5, 10, 20, 50 times, that's not usually what a spreadsheet can do well. And it doesn't scale to thousands and hundreds of thousands of rows, which is what we're looking at for something on the scale of Smithsonian or other museums. So the solution that I was thinking of after working on many projects over the last few years is the extract and load actually aren't that hard, right? You're basically going to an API, getting content, and you're loading it into Wiki. The transform is the complex part. And how can we handle the transform without being a developer is another part of the solution. right? So what if that extract, transform, load, 80% of it is exactly the same, right? The extract from a JSON API is well known. The load part is well known. So what if you could, almost like a Nintendo cartridge or Atari cartridge, plug into this just the specifics for the GLAM entity that we're concerned with, to say that I know the field's coming from here, I know the field's going to there, and that's all you needed to change in a workflow. So that's basically what we have as a task in front of us. Some of the basic things we want to do when we're transforming data from a GLAM entity, for example, to the Commons and Wikidata models is direct copying, right? Here's the ID from the API. I'm just going to copy it over to Commons. That's easy. A simple transformation, like if I see the word human, like the type of thing that's object is a human, I'll map it to Q5 on Wikidata or Commons. So that's something that we'd like to be able to do. Another thing is being able to extract parts of a string, right? So if we're seeing something from the API that's this long string, let's say I only want this little part of it, like an identifier, a word, or a title, or something like that. You can do that as well with a regular expression, let's say. And then a crosswalk. This is more complicated, but let's say there's a controlled vocabulary in the GLAM side. Let's say it'll be one of 15 departments. So if I notice that a string matches here, I want to generate some Q numbers as a result of that, right? So, for example, for the Met, we had evening dress at the Met, and we would generate a P31 statement or instance of dress and evening wear as part of that. So we'd like to be able to do that through a kind of a mapping table. So those are kind of the desired range of operations. And the cool thing is it's not that hard if we break it down to that. So if you had something like a YAML file, which is a very simple configuration file, it's much more human readable than your other formats like JSON. And then we use a tool like JSON Path. This is kind of the key to everything here. So there actually is a cool kind of query language for JSON, which allows mere mortals to say, I want to pick out this thing in the JSON file. I want to pick out this series of things in the JSON file. So it gives you kind of like developer powers without having to be a Python developer. So that's kind of cool to have that, right? So this is basically what JSON path looks like. Like if I've got this complex JSON structure on the left-hand side, all I need to do is just specify how I want to traverse that JSON tree, and it'll extract that for me. So as long as you have a list of these things, it can do all the hard work for you, right? So for example, it'll grab the title here if you specify this JSON path syntax like that. So once we have that kind of set up, we can actually just have this config file, which is just a text file that anyone can edit to help the mappings across from the API into our wiki world. So we actually have that working right now on the Smithsonian side for most of the units. It's going to be more complex for things like natural history, where you have like thousands and thousands of specimens and very detailed things. But for now, for art museums, for history museums, for Air and Space Museum, it actually works pretty well. If you want, you can go in and take a look at an example of that config file to see how robust it can be. But basically, we're trying to map what is in an API to these commons fields in the template, which is what we'd like to see in a commons file, right? Here's just an example of what that YAML file looks like. Just out of need, we found we needed to specify fields and things about permissions and static mappings, things like that. I won't go into all the details, but you can examine that later on if you like. But the cool thing is that you're wondering, well, don't I still need to know JSON? The cool thing is we have really nice tools online where you just load up the JSON file on the left-hand side, and you just kind of point and click and say, I want this field, and it'll actually generate the JSON path syntax for you, and you can just copy and paste that into the config file, which is really nice, right? So it's kind of like a forensic tool for digging through a JSON structure. It can get pretty complex as they get pretty big and loud and wide. Other things that are cool about this is that it already works with structured data on commons. So the number of tools that edit structured data on commons is not huge, right? We've got quick statements that supports it. PyWikibot framework does not support SDC directly as of now. So the nice thing about a tool like this is that you can actually have these mappings like this. So this works right now where you can say, oh, I'm sure that any object that comes through from the Smithsonian API is going to be CC0 and the copyright status is released under these terms. So I can make this kind of mapping here, and that's added to SDC statements on the commons file, which is nice. So it's another way of working with SDC as a tool. So the status right now is a prototype Python utility. It uses a YAML file. It can upload files to Commons. It can add structured data on common statements. It uses a Python package, JSON Path.ng. JSON Path is really not terribly standardized. Like, it started out really nicely, but there's a lot of different variants. So I'm using JSON Path.ng. It works with most Smithsonian units, but we're also looking for other folks, because it's not just for Smithsonian. Any kind of API that is regular and JSON can be mapped in this way. So here's just an example of the rudimentary interface we have right now. You can kind of load a bunch of IDs, click on the ID, and it'll kind of bring up a preview. Here it's using IIIF to bring up a preview image, and then you can just hit go, and it'll load that up to Commons and SDC, which is pretty neat. So features to be developed, well, it'd be nice to do some reconciliation. So you can specify a reconciliation in there, which is kind of nice, and you can maybe give more hints to say, I want to reconcile against humans or this type of occupation, things like that. So it'd be nice to figure out nice ways of doing that. It'd be nice to have a better user interface than that very rudimentary one. And the code is not released quite yet. I need to clean it up and make it more modular, but we hope to release some of the code later on this year. And some open questions is the YAML file approach robust and expressive enough for pretty much all transformations? I think so far we found it is. Single fields, variable length records, like an object that has 10 photos. Can you handle that? Yeah, we can. Can you handle a crosswalk database saying this term maps to that term? Yes. Conditional logic, you can kind of do that as well. You can kind of say in the config file, if this, then that. You can do basic things like that. And then reconciliation is also another thing we'd like to have there as well. So the cool thing about this is it's not a competitor per se. In fact, if this config file is made for a GLAM entity, you could have PattyPan or OpenRefine or even GLAM pipe, all those things I talked about, actually ingest that config file and use those mappings in a useful way, which is really cool, right? So some of the stuff that Sandro Fauconnier is working on, or Albin with PattyPan, this crosswalking of the fields from the API to what we want on Wiki could be useful for anyone who's interested in mapping those things across. So a bunch of tools could use that. And you could also store these YAML files not on your computer, but on Wiki. So you could collaboratively edit the YAML files and improve the configuration over and over. And let's say another museum wants to do it, they can copy over someone else's YAML file and start working with that. So there's a lot of cool things you can do if you're sharing it on Wiki. And then Albin, I was talking to him, said, well, it'd be kind of cool if we had a query type thing where people could just kind of see ingestion batches and learn from them. And I think that's a great idea. You could actually have a portal where people share their config files and share, how successful or not successful their ingest processes were, which is pretty cool. So that's just some of the things that could happen from that. So I'd be happy to take any questions or discussions around what other tools might benefit from a similar approach, or if you know of other tools that already do this approach. GlamPipe is doing really cool things in this area. What type of features could be further developed that might be useful to folks up there? So I want to leave some time for Q&A or some discussion. I'm happy to take that, and I'll kind of scroll back in the chat right now to see what kind of comments are there. So yeah, folks are talking about Minefield, which is a great tool to take a list of Commons file names and get the MIDs out of it, which is really nice because it's not always easy to find all the MIDs for working with those objects. Oh, can I put the gist link in the chat? Yeah, I should be able to do that. In fact, I can bring it up on screen if we want to take a quick look at it. Here's the gist file right there. So I can paste that into the chat if people want to take a look at that. A little small there, but you can see, you can define the API URL. I didn't put the API key obviously in there, but it just shows how to get to the API. And then you can come down here and start to look at how those fields map. Like, we want to see these in Commons, and here's how to actually get to those files. I'm sorry, to those fields in the JSON right there. So can you talk more about the current reconciliation capability? There isn't really, like, I haven't built that part yet, but it would call the reconciliation API directly. And then you could actually use directives in the YAML file to say, constrain it to like humans or constrain it to occupations of a certain type. So I know the OpenRefine has some very crude ways of saying, resolve it to a human. But sometimes, especially for art museums, you want to resolve to either a human or a fashion house or an institution or a publishing agent, and it's kind of hard to do that in my experience with OpenRefine. But with this, you could kind of have this weird hodgepodge of things to resolve against, I think. So, yeah, someone said, I find reconciliation is always a problem. That is absolutely right. And on the batch level, I don't know. You're going to reconcile against it, but you still want human eyeballs to kind of confirm that reconciliation is a valid match, right? Peace Ray says, would you be able to produce a map for each institution and feed it into the map module? I don't know. I might need more information on that to figure it out. I mean, this general approach could work for a number of things. So maybe, I guess, is the answer. So Ari saying, yes, this sounds really good. Could there be a repository of config files? Absolutely. I mean, that's the idea, is that the same way that like something like Cradle has all their config files on Wiki, or any of the tools that store their config files on Wiki would be really a great approach. Right now, the crosswalk database that we have for the Met is actually stored on Wiki. Like, just say this control vocabulary from the Met maps to these Q numbers in Wikidata, and it'd be neat to see different organizations share their crosswalk databases in a common place on Wiki. Yeah, so I don't know when the end time of this session is exactly, but I will depend on the moderator to tell me when we are done. I think 15. Oh, we have 4 more minutes. Okay, great. So any other questions as I go back here? Oh, Magnus says, will you store the YAML in Wiki Commons? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's the big question working with SDC is, do you store it on Wikidata? Do you store it on Commons? Do you store it somewhere else? Good question. I don't have a great answer for that. Yeah. Yes. So Olaf says he wrote a script to bulk SDC from Excel, focused on P180 or depiction, but can be tweaked for other Ps. That's really cool. Yeah, I think we have a smattering of tools that all do this in some way, but we've never kind of centralized it into any kind of framework that people can contribute to in a kind of a data workflow process. Like, I've got my own share of spreadsheets with custom formulas. I've got my own share of custom scripts, but it'd be nice to have a better modular framework like this, where we kind of share config files and best practices in a way that is reinforcing, rather than having everything in their own kind of user accounts and siloed on their own. And I'm guilty of that too. Like, we have a really cool tool for the Met Museum, but it's just a monolithic Python script, and that's not that helpful to everyone. So it'd be nice to abstract this to the point where we're sharing just a YAML file on, as Magnus says, either Commons or Wikidata, and all you need to do is just point the tool at that config file, and anyone who's a volunteer could just start ingesting content from a GLAM entity, just because someone took the time to find the mappings from that API. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Shani. Shani says, what's next for your work at the Met and Smithsonian, if you can share? Yeah, this is just a very narrow project, which is trying to get the 3 million some records that the Smithsonian has put in under open access efficiently into Wikidata and Commons. And some of the other stuff that we'll be talking about in the afternoon at the 4 o'clock, I'm sorry, in about 2 hours or an hour or so, is knowledge graphs and the types of things you can do once you have comprehensive image and database uploads. I think in about an hour will be the session that I'll be talking about our Metropolitan Museum of Artwork. And then in about 3 hours will be some of the stuff we're doing about women's biographies. And a lot of that benefits from uploading things from the Smithsonian. They have a specific women's history initiative that is the main motivation for this tool, is that if we have every unit at the Smithsonian, across all 19 units pretty much, has like a women's history initiative point person, and they want to contribute lists of images of materials that we can upload. And that's where the need for this came, is that I don't have time to train 19 different people how to use this tool. So it wouldn't be nice to have it as simple as possible and have a user interface for any one of those 19 folks at those institutions be able to have one-click upload of a list of objects. And that's kind of the end goal. So thanks, Johnny. That's That's a great question. All right. Oh, thanks, Jan. 45 minutes from now is the Met Museum with Wikidata. Yeah. Great. The knowledge graph, the one in 45 minutes, we'll be showing some of the knowledge graph stuff. And then also at the Women in Red one in 3 hours from now. All right, thanks, folks. I'll leave it to the next group.